Hey guys, tonight we're talking about what life was really like for a Teutonic Knight on Crusade. Picture this, an organisation that combined the poverty vows of monks with the killing efficiency of professional soldiers, wrapped in white cloaks and convinced God wanted them to conquer an entire country. The Teutonic Order wasn't about rescuing Jerusalem or protecting pilgrims. By the 1240s, they'd pivoted to something far more profitable. They were running a corporate crusade in Prussia, converting pagans at sword point while building a merchant empire that would make modern corporations jealous. These warrior monks took vows of celibacy, then spent their summers burning villages and their winters managing vast agricultural estates. They promised eternal salvation through holy war, delivered through systematic ethnic cleansing. The contradiction would be darkly hilarious if it hadn't killed tens of thousands. Dear viewers, our big goal is to reach 1,000 subscribers on this channel, and with your support we can achieve it. Only on our channel will you find such interesting and unique stories about war. Subscribe so you don't miss them. We are sincerely grateful to everyone who helps us achieve this goal. Also, write in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. I'm always curious to see people from all over the world brought together by a single story. And now, let's move on to today's story. Heinrich von Ballenstedt was 17 when he walked into the commandery at Marienburg in the winter of 1242. He'd never questioned whether pagans deserved death for refusing Christ. He'd never doubted that the Church's word was literal truth, that demons walk the earth in human form, that salvation required blood. He knew God demanded the expansion of Christendom the way he knew winter followed autumn, as natural law, unchangeable and right. The youngest son of a minor nobleman, Heinrich had been destined for the Church since birth. His older brothers inherited land. He inherited a calling. The Teutonic fortress rose from the frozen marsh like a stone fist. Ice clung to walls 30 feet high. Guard towers watched the Nogat River where it cut through conquered territory. Inside those walls lived 200 warrior monks who transformed religious devotion into military science. This wasn't a monastery. This was headquarters for an invasion that had been grinding forward for 40 years. Heinrich entered through gates thick enough to stop battering rams. The courtyard smelled of horse manure, wood smoke, and the metallic tang of the forge. Knights in white cloaks moved with purpose between buildings, their breath steaming. No one acknowledged him. New recruits arrived weekly, desperate younger sons and true believers seeking purpose. Most wouldn't last 5 years. Disease, combat, and disillusionment harvested them efficiently. The master of novices was a scarred veteran named Dietrich who'd lost 2 fingers to a Prussian axe. He looked at Heinrich the way farmers examined livestock, assessing worth, calculating utility. The inspection took 30 seconds. Heinrich passed not through divine favour, but because he had working limbs and could afford the entrance donation. The order needed bodies more than it needed saints. The first shock came that evening during the initiation ceremony. Heinrich had imagined something spiritual, transformative. Instead, 60 novices stood in a cold chapel, while a priest rattled through Latin prayers at a speed that suggested boredom. The commitment wasn't to God primarily, but to the order. To obey commanders absolutely, to fight when ordered, to kill without question. The vow of celibacy was practical, not holy. Wives meant divided loyalties. Children meant inheritance disputes. The order wanted weapons without complications. When Heinrich swore to lifelong poverty, he learned the word didn't mean what he'd thought. Knights owned nothing individually but lived well on the order's collective wealth. They ate meat daily, a luxury peasants tasted twice a year. They slept in heated dormitories while commoners froze in hovels. Poverty meant profit flowed upward to the organisation, not that anyone suffered want. The deception was elegant. Recruit idealists with talk of sacrifice, then provide comfort in exchange for obedience. Training began before dawn the next morning. Not prayer first, but physical conditioning that would have killed weaker men. Heinrich ran through snow until his lungs burned. He lifted stones until his arms trembled. Veterans beat rhythm with wooden practice swords while novices executed drills in formation. The movements weren't about honour or artistry, but efficiency. How to kill quickly, how to break bones through mail armour, how to cut through flesh with minimum wasted motion. The weapons training revealed truths that shattered Heinrich's tournament fantasies. Real combat wasn't about elegant swordplay. A knight in full armour became a tank of meat and metal, nearly impervious to light weapons but slow and exhausting to operate. The key wasn't speed but endurance, outlasting your opponent until fatigue created an opening. Then you struck at joints, gaps, weak points. The goal wasn't a clean kill but any kill at all. Sword techniques focused on half-swording, gripping the blade with one armoured hand to use the weapon like a short spear, driving the point through mail rings or into eye slots. Maces and warhammers were better against armour anyway, but the order considered swords spiritually significant. The blade was Christian, symbolic of the cross. Never mind that Prussian pagans also used swords. Symbolism mattered more than effectiveness. Heinrich's first armour fitting occurred in February, 2 months after arrival. The armourers measured him carefully, then brought pieces from the order's stores. Nothing was custom-made for novices. Knights who died in Prussia left their equipment for replacements. Heinrich wore a dead man's habergeon, knee-length chainmail that weighed 40 pounds. Over that came a padded gambeson to prevent the mail from shredding skin. A coat of plates added another 20 pounds of metal coverage. The great helm enclosed his head in an iron prison that reduced vision to a narrow slit, and turned, breathing into conscious effort. Standing in full armour for the first time, Heinrich understood the reality veterans never mentioned. This wasn't empowerment. This was imprisonment in your own defensive shell. Every movement required double the normal effort. In summer heat, knights cooked inside metal shells, losing water weight so fast they'd pass out mid-battle. In winter, the metal leached warmth from your body faster than exercise could replace it. The armour that made you nearly invincible also made you vulnerable to exhaustion, heat stroke, and drowning in water barely waist deep. Training in armour began immediately. Heinrich spent hours learning to mount a horse while carrying 70 pounds of equipment. He practiced getting up after falling, a simple action that became an ordeal in full gear. Veterans watched novices struggle and laughed, remembering their own humiliation. The lesson was clear. Knighthood wasn't nobility. It was skilled labour that destroyed your body. The order's daily schedule mimicked monastic routine. Prayers at dawn, training until midday, prayers again, more training, evening prayers, sleep. But the prayers felt performative, empty rituals surrounding the real work of creating killers. Heinrich noticed veterans muttering through Latin they didn't understand, racing to finish so they could return to weapon maintenance or tactical discussions. The military discipline was genuine. The religious devotion was theatre. Brother Conrad, a knight who'd fought in Prussia for 15 years, explained the order's true purpose during a rare moment of honesty. The Crusade had nothing to do with converting pagans and everything to do with land acquisition. The Church provided legal cover for conquest. If you called invasion a holy mission, you could recruit fanatics to die cheaply while building a territorial empire. The Order now controlled vast stretches of the Baltic coast, extracting wealth through taxes, tribute, and trade monopolies. They'd become what they claimed to oppose, a secular power using religion as justification. The financial system shocked Heinrich more than the violence. The Order operated like a merchant consortium, managing agricultural estates, running amber trade routes, lending money at interest despite church prohibitions on usury. They called it banking for crusade funding. Actually, they were accumulating capital to expand their political influence. The white cloaks and crosses were branding, nothing more. They sold an image of holy warriors to attract donations while operating like any other ambitious state. Conrad described the Prussian campaigns with the enthusiasm of an accountant discussing revenue streams. Each summer, the order launched expeditions into unconquered territory. They'd burn pagan villages, kill or enslave the inhabitants, then establish Christian settler colonies on the depopulated land. The new settlements paid taxes to the order. The cycle repeated. It was colonization disguised as evangelism, genocide rebranded as missionary work. The efficiency was impressive. The morality was non-existent. Heinrich asked if the pagans ever surrendered peacefully. Conrad laughed, a bitter sound empty of humour. Some did, he admitted. They'd accept baptism to save their families, then the order would immediately impose crushing taxes and labour obligations. Conversion meant nothing without submission. The goal wasn't Christian souls, but compliant subjects. Pagans who resisted died. Pagans who converted became exploited labourers. Either way, the order profited. The transformation from idealistic novice to cynical soldier took 6 months. By summer 1243, Heinrich no longer believed the propaganda that had recruited him. He understood he'd joined a military order that had perfected the art of profitable warfare. They'd industrialised crusading, turning holy war into a sustainable business model. Faith was the marketing, violence was the product, territory was the profit. But Heinrich couldn't leave. The vows were lifetime commitments enforced by church law and order discipline. Deserters faced excommunication, spiritual death that barred you from salvation. Worse, the order hunted deserters physically, making examples of men who broke faith. Heinrich had trapped himself in an organisation he no longer respected, bound by promises he regretted, committed to violence he was beginning to find morally repugnant. The final test before active service came in late summer. Each novice had to kill a pig in full armour using only a sword. The exercise taught nothing about combat, but everything about psychological preparation. Could you take a life while looking into eyes that showed fear and intelligence? Could you stomach the blood, the sounds, the smell of death? Heinrich passed. He drove his blade through the pig's throat efficiently, watched it die, felt nothing. The emptiness worried him more than revulsion would have. In September 1243, Heinrich took his final vows and received his white cloak with its black cross. He was now a brother knight of the Teutonic Order, bound to fight until death or disability ended his service. The ceremony was brief, the words familiar, the outcome inevitable. Heinrich knelt as a conflicted boy and rose as a weapon the order would aim at Prussia. The veteran knights welcomed him with grim practicality. They'd seen countless bright-eyed recruits arrive with illusions about glory in God's work. Most learned the truth quickly. Some died before they could. The rest became like Conrad, men who did terrible things because their vows left no alternative, who justified horror through necessity, who'd stopped asking whether their cause was just. Heinrich's first assignment would come with spring campaign season. Until then, he'd spend winter at Marienburg learning siegecraft, studying Prussian military tactics, and maintaining the endless equipment that kept armoured warfare functional. He'd pray with men who didn't believe their own prayers. He'd eat meals with soldiers who'd burned families alive. He'd become one of them because the order allowed no other option. The fortress walls that had seemed protective in winter now felt confining. Heinrich was 17 years old, permanently committed to an organisation he didn't trust, trained to kill people he didn't hate, trapped in a crusade he knew was fundamentally corrupt. The black cross on his white cloak wasn't a symbol of faith anymore. It was a brand marking him as property of the Teutonic Order, a tool to be used until broken. Outside the fortress walls, Prussia waited, vast forests and marshlands where pagan tribes prepared for another summer of fighting Christian invaders. They'd been resisting for 4 decades with determination born of desperation. Their homes, their gods, their entire way of life faced extinction at the hands of men like Heinrich, warriors who'd convinced themselves that conquest was conversion, that murder was mission work, that God endorsed everything they did. Heinrich knew better now. He understood exactly what he'd become and what he'd have to do. That knowledge didn't free him. It just made him complicit, aware that every life he'd take would be taken not for God, but for the Order's territorial ambitions. The guilt would come later. First came the killing. The crusading force assembled in March 1244, when winter's grip loosened enough for travel but cold still killed the careless. 200 knights formed the corps, each accompanied by squires, servants and equipment bearers. 500 mercenary infantry, Germans, Poles, Bohemians who fought for wages rather than salvation. 300 conscripted peasants who'd been given spears and told dying for Christ earned heavenly rewards. Behind them trailed a logistics train of wagons, pack animals, camp followers, prostitutes, blacksmiths, surgeons and priests. An army of 1,000 souls moving east toward violence. Heinrich rode in the middle ranks, anonymous among dozens of newly sworn knights. His horse was a destrier bred for carrying armoured men, powerful but not particularly intelligent. The animal had cost more than a peasant family earned in 5 years. The Order owned it, like they owned everything Heinrich would touch for the rest of his life. Even his salvation was leased property, contingent on continued service. The column stretched for miles along muddy roads that disappeared into forests primeval and hostile. Germany felt civilized compared to what waited ahead. Here stood churches, villages, cultivated fields. The landscape spoke of centuries of Christian occupation, of Roman organization imposed on tribal chaos. Every cross-marked territory conquered not last year but generations ago, so thoroughly dominated that no one remembered alternatives. They crossed into Poland within a week, following the Vistula River north toward the Baltic coast. Polish territories showed the Crusade's secondary purpose, political pressure on neighbouring Christian kingdoms. The Order's expansion threatened Polish access to the sea, but the Pope blessed the mission, so Polish nobility had to cooperate or face accusations of impeding holy work. It was extortion sanctified by religious authority, and everyone involved understood the game. The first destroyed village appeared 3 days into Polish territory, burned the previous summer during a dispute between the Order and local lords. Blackened timber frames stood like skeletal fingers pointing accusations at the sky. No bodies remained. Wolves and ravens had cleaned the site efficiently. But Heinrich could imagine the screams, smell the smoke, picture families dying because powerful men disagreed about boundaries and tribute. This was Christian on Christian violence, expedient and quickly forgotten. Brother Conrad rode beside Heinrich, pointing out landmarks with the enthusiasm of a tour guide describing vacation destinations. That hill fort housed Polish forces that had ambushed an Order column 5 years back. Those fields once belonged to a monastery before the Order seized them for unpaid debts. The forest ahead harboured bandits who occasionally raided supply trains, disappearing before retaliation arrived. Every mile carried history written in blood, conquest and exploitation. The army followed established crusading routes, paths worn smooth by decades of military traffic, moving between German lands and the Prussian frontier. Villagers along these roads specialized in servicing armed columns, selling food at inflated prices, offering prostitutes to soldiers with coin, disposing of bodies when disease struck the camps. Crusading had become routine commerce. Holy war transformed into seasonal employment. Disease hit the conscripted peasants first. Dysentery spread through men unused to military life, unfamiliar with hygiene discipline that kept larger forces functional. They shat themselves bloody, died in roadside ditches, were buried in unmarked graves or simply left for scavengers. The army didn't slow. Replacements would come from conquered territories, recently baptized Prussians forced into service against their own people. The order wasted nothing, not even enemies who'd surrendered. A mercenary captain named Gottfried commanded the infantry with casual brutality that made the knights seem gentle. He'd fought in a dozen campaigns across Europe, selling his skills to whoever paid best. Religion meant nothing to him. The cross on banners was just another employer's sigil, no different than a duke's heraldry or a merchant guild's mark. He treated war as skilled labour. You showed up, killed efficiently, collected wages, moved to the next contract. His men reflected his philosophy, fighting not for God but for silver that bought women, ale, and temporary comfort. Tensions simmered between the professional soldiers and the idealistic knights, though both groups shared contempt for conscripted peasants. The mercenaries mocked knightly vows of poverty, while knights lived better than most merchants. Knights dismissed mercenaries as soulless killers, while planning massacres themselves. The hypocrisy was obvious to Heinrich now, impossible to ignore once you noticed it. Everyone was here for profit or obligation, dressed in whatever justification made sleep possible. They reached the Order's forward fortress at Kulm in early April. The castle dominated a river crossing, controlling movement between German-held territory and the Prussian wilderness. Walls twice the height of Marienburg enclosed barracks, granaries, workshops, and a chapel large enough for 500 worshippers. This wasn't temporary occupation, but permanent colonization, German architecture and organization imposed on conquered land. The garrison commander was a weathered knight named Friedrich, who'd spent 20 years fighting Prussians. Scars mapped his face like rivers on a chart. He'd lost an eye to an arrow that had punched through his helm's vision slit, 1 in 1,000 unlucky shot. The wound hadn't killed him, so the Order kept using him until the next injury finished the job. That was the contract, unwritten but absolute. Friedrich described the strategic situation with the detachment of a chess player analysing board positions. The Order controlled the Vistula corridor and the coast, hemming Prussians against the wilderness interior. Each summer's campaign pushed the frontier deeper, establishing new castles that became bases for further expansion. The process was methodical, inevitable, and would continue until the Prussians were extinct or assimilated. Questions of morality never entered his tactical assessments. The army stayed 3 days at Kulm, resupplying from the fortress stores and integrating local forces. Another 100 knights joined from garrisons along the frontier. 200 recently baptized Prussians were conscripted as guides and auxiliary fighters. These converts moved among the Christian soldiers with careful subservience, knowing a single misstep could mean death. Their conversion hadn't earned trust, only the opportunity to prove loyalty through violence against their own people. Heinrich watched the Prussian auxiliaries with uncomfortable recognition. They'd made the same choice he had: join the Order or face destruction. Their submission was tactical, survival dressed as faith. He wondered how many believed the prayers they were forced to recite, how many plotted revenge while bowing before the cross. The Order seemed unconcerned about their sincerity. Obedience was measured in actions, not thoughts. The column departed Kulm, heading northeast into territory that had been pagan 15 years earlier. Christian settlement here was recent and precarious. German farmers worked fields their Polish and German predecessors had cleared by burning Prussian villages. The churches were new construction, stone and timber fresh enough to smell of cut wood and mortar. Garrisons watched from fortified manors, ready to suppress any uprising among the conquered population. The landscape changed as they moved deeper into frontier zones. Forests grew denser, roads deteriorated into muddy tracks, and villages appeared less frequently. The visible Christian infrastructure gave way to wilderness that had never been fully pacified. This was contested ground where Prussian raiding parties struck supply lines, where order patrols sometimes disappeared completely, where the war remained active rather than historical. Brother Conrad's demeanour shifted as civilization fell behind. He checked weapons constantly, scanned tree lines with veteran paranoia, and slept in armour despite the discomfort. The casual confidence he'd displayed at Marienburg vanished, replaced by the tension of a man who'd survived ambushes through vigilance rather than luck. Other veterans showed similar changes, wordlessly communicating that they'd entered the killing ground. The first ambush came at dawn on the 8th day from Kulm. Prussian warriors hit the supply train's rear, killing 10 conscripts before melting back into forest thick enough to hide armies. The attack lasted 90 seconds. The crusaders responded with disorganized pursuit that captured nothing but exhausted men. By the time knights organized a proper search, the attackers had vanished along paths only locals knew existed. The column continued northeast but with tighter formation and heightened paranoia. Scouts ranged ahead, mercenaries guarded the flanks, and rearguard forces stayed alert for another strike. The pace slowed as caution overcame the urgency to reach campaign objectives. Dead conscripts lay where they'd fallen. The army couldn't spare time for burial, and the bodies served as warnings to potential attackers. See what happens when you resist. See what we do to those who oppose God's will. They passed through the ruins of a major Prussian settlement destroyed 3 years prior. The fortifications had been impressive. Earthwork walls 20 feet high, timber palisades, defensive ditches. The Order had besieged it for 6 weeks before finally breaching the walls. Every inhabitant had been killed or enslaved. The site now stood empty, colonized only by weeds and scavengers. This was the Crusades' reality, not conversion but annihilation, not missionary work but ethnic erasure. Heinrich's illusions about noble warfare died in those ruins. He saw where homes had burned with families inside, where children's bodies had been stacked like cordwood, where the Order's famous discipline had meant nothing when blood frenzy took hold. Veterans walked through the site with indifference born of familiarity. They'd seen dozens of such places, participated in creating them, and would make more before the summer ended. The horror was routine. We hope you have already subscribed to our channel, and if not, please do so right now. Our goal is to reach our first 1,000 subscribers. This is very important to us. Only on our channel will you find such interesting and unique stories about war. Subscribe so you don't miss them, and we'll get back to the story. The column reached its destination in late April, a newly constructed fortress called Balga, built the previous year on conquered ground. The castle sat on a defensible hill overlooking marshlands that stretched to the horizon. Beyond those marshes lay unconquered Prussian territories, the target of this summer's campaign. Balga would serve as the forward base, the launching point for raids that would push Christianity's frontier another few miles into the wilderness. The fortress was crude compared to Marienburg, built for function rather than permanence, wooden palisades instead of stone curtain walls, thatched roofs on most buildings rather than tile or slate. The chapel was barely larger than a storage shed. This was military infrastructure, temporary occupation that might become permanent if the summer's fighting went well. If the Prussians counter-attacked successfully, Balga would burn and the frontier would retreat. The garrison that had overwintered at Balga looked haunted. 40 knights and 200 support personnel had held this position through 6 months of isolation, constant raids, and winter scarcity. They had lost 15 men to disease, another 8 to Prussian attacks, and countless more to injuries and frostbite. Their relief at seeing reinforcements was palpable, but tempered by knowledge that the arrivals would experience the same horrors. Commander Friedrich addressed the assembled force in Balga's muddy courtyard, laying out the summer's objectives with bureaucratic precision. They would secure the surrounding marshlands, destroy 3 known Prussian fortifications, establish 2 new forward positions, and convert or kill every pagan within 20 miles. The goals were specific, measurable, achievable. Corporate objectives applied to genocide. Heinrich felt the weight of what he'd committed to settle like lead in his gut. This wasn't a single battle or brief campaign, but an ongoing project of systematic destruction. He'd spend the next 6 months killing people who'd never heard of his god, burning homes because they were built in the wrong location, and calling it all holy work. The justifications he'd believed in winter felt obscene now, standing in this frontier fortress surrounded by men preparing for organised slaughter. But Heinrich was a Teutonic Knight, bound by vows that superseded personal morality. His opinions on the Crusade's justice were irrelevant. The Order would use him as they used every resource, efficiently, completely, until he broke. Then they'd replace him with another idealistic boy who believed propaganda about saving souls. The machine was larger than any individual, grinding forward regardless of doubts or deaths. Night fell over Balga with the sounds of an army preparing for war. Smiths repaired equipment, soldiers sharpened weapons, priests heard confessions from men who knew they might not see autumn. Heinrich sat alone on the fortress walls, looking out at the darkened marshlands where Prussian forces watched the Christian invaders, planning their own strategies for survival. Tomorrow the killing would begin in earnest. Tonight everyone pretended they were warriors rather than participants in mechanized murder. The difference mattered even if the outcome didn't. Dawn at Balga began with bells that cracked the darkness at 4 a.m, summoning knights to the first of 7 daily prayer sessions. Heinrich stumbled from his straw pallet in the communal barracks, joints aching from sleeping in mail he'd been too exhausted to remove. 30 knights shared the draughty hall, snoring and farting through the night like any group of men packed too closely together. The romance of knighthood didn't survive sharing sleeping quarters with unwashed soldiers who'd eaten beans and salted pork. The chapel offered no warmth despite bodies crowding the benches. A sleepy priest rushed through Latin prayers while knights mouthed words they'd memorized without understanding. The devotion lasted exactly as long as required by the Order's rule. 30 minutes at dawn, 15 minutes before each meal, another 30 at Compline before sleep. Religion operated on a schedule. Faith measured in man-hours like any other labour requirement. Breakfast came after dawn prayers in a refectory that smelled of smoke, old grease, and unwashed bodies. Porridge made from barley, hard bread, weak beer. The knights ate in silence per monastic rules, though veterans communicated through gestures that had evolved into wordless language. A certain look meant the porridge tasted like paste. A hand motion indicated someone had pissed in the beer again. The discipline was facade, human nature finding expression despite regulations. Morning training began at first light regardless of weather. Heinrich joined 50 other knights in the muddy practice yard, moving through sword forms until sweat soaked his undertunic despite the spring chill. The exercises were brutally simple: overhead strikes, horizontal cuts, thrusts at imaginary opponents. Thousands of repetitions burned the movements into muscle memory so battle would trigger reflex rather than thought. Thinking got you killed. Training made killing automatic. After sword work came wrestling in armour, learning to grapple and throw when weapons broke or were lost. 2 knights would grab each other and struggle until one hit the ground or yielded. The bouts were exhausting, humiliating, and occasionally dangerous when someone landed wrong and broke ribs. Heinrich lost more matches than he won, pinned by veterans who'd learned every dirty trick through decades of survival. There was no honour in real fighting. There was only winning and dying. The fortress operated like a military monastery, every hour assigned to prayer, training, labour or rest. Knights spent afternoons maintaining equipment that required constant attention to remain functional. Chainmail rusted if not regularly oiled. Leather straps rotted in the dampness. Sword edges dulled from use and had to be sharpened on whetstones until your arms burned. The maintenance was endless, tedious, and absolutely critical. Equipment failure in battle meant death. Heinrich learned that professional soldiers spent 90% of their time on logistics and preparation, 10% on actual combat. The tedious work kept armies functional, stockpiling food, organising supply chains, repairing fortifications, training replacements, managing the subject population. War was administration with occasional violence, bureaucracy punctuated by murder. The crusade ran on paperwork as much as faith. The relationship between the order and local Christian settlers revealed the colonial project's true nature. German and Polish farmers who'd been granted conquered land paid heavy taxes to the order, 1/3 of all grain produced, plus additional levies for military service, road maintenance, and whatever else the knights demanded. The settlers had traded serfdom in their homelands for quasi-freedom in Prussia, but the order extracted wealth just as efficiently as any feudal lord. The fortress dungeon held 18 prisoners in conditions that would have violated even medieval standards if anyone had cared. Prussian captives languished in cells barely large enough to lie down, fed starvation rations, interrogated through torture techniques the order had refined over decades. Some were held for ransom from tribes still free. Others were kept as examples. Their suffering meant to terrorize the surrounding population into submission. 2 had been there so long they'd lost their minds, babbling in languages even other Prussians couldn't understand. Heinrich was assigned guard duty in the dungeons his second week at Balga. The stone cells were perpetually damp, smelling of human waste and infection. Prisoners moaned through the night, calling out to gods the knights claimed didn't exist. One man had been tortured so extensively his hands were ruined claws, bones broken and healed wrong because no one bothered treating captives' injuries. He would never hold a weapon again, which was precisely the point. The order didn't just defeat enemies, it destroyed them as warnings. The brutality had purpose beyond cruelty. Every broken prisoner became a story spread through Prussian communities. Resist, and this happens to you, your family, everyone you love. The psychological warfare was often more effective than military campaigns. Fear could pacify regions that armies struggled to control. The order understood that conquered peoples needed to believe resistance was futile, that cooperation was the only path to survival. The dungeons manufactured that belief through systematic horror. Brother Conrad explained the taxation system with the pride of someone describing an elegant machine. The order had divided conquered territories into administrative districts, each overseen by a knight who collected tribute, adjudicated disputes, and suppressed any sign of rebellion. The system was Roman efficiency applied to colonial exploitation. Organize the conquered, extract their wealth, use that wealth to fund further conquest. The crusade was self-financing once you controlled enough land. The Christian settlers weren't allies but assets, human resources deployed to hold territory the order captured. They were deliberately settled in mixed communities, Germans, Poles, Lithuanians, even baptized Prussians forced into proximity that prevented ethnic solidarity. The strategy was divide and rule, ensuring no unified resistance could form. When settlers did rebel against taxation, the order crushed them as thoroughly as pagan uprisings. The White Cloak served the order first, Christianity second, and human welfare not at all. Heinrich witnessed a public execution his third week at Balga. A baptized Prussian had been caught passing information to unconquered tribes, names of settlers who'd collaborated, details of garrison strength, layouts of fortifications. The evidence was circumstantial, but the order didn't require proof beyond reasonable doubt. Suspicion was sufficient. The man was hanged in Balga's courtyard while the entire garrison watched, his body left dangling for 3 days as object lesson before being cut down and dumped in a marsh. The execution bothered Heinrich less than it should have. He was adapting to the casual violence, becoming desensitized to suffering that had shocked him weeks earlier. The transformation frightened him more than the violence itself. How quickly humans normalized horror. How easily moral standards eroded under constant exposure to brutality. The order didn't just train knights to kill, it trained them to stop caring. The fortress preparations intensified as campaign season approached. Blacksmiths worked around the clock forging arrowheads, spear points, and nails for siege equipment. Carpenters built scaling ladders and portable bridges for crossing defensive ditches. The quartermaster inventoried supplies with obsessive detail. How many barrels of salted pork, how much grain, how many horseshoes and replacement weapons. Modern armies would recognize the logistics planning, the careful calculation of supply versus campaign duration. Heinrich was assigned to a squad of 10 knights under a veteran sergeant named Otto, who'd survived 8 Prussian campaigns. Otto's survival wasn't luck but calculated risk management. He never took unnecessary chances, never led charges that weren't carefully planned, and abandoned hopeless situations without shame. His philosophy was simple. Dead heroes couldn't fight next season, but living cowards could. The order needed survivors more than martyrs. The squad trained together daily, learning to fight as a unit rather than individuals. In formation, knights presented an armoured wall that few infantry could break. They'd advance shoulder to shoulder, shields overlapping, supporting each other against counterattacks. The tactic was ancient but effective. Roman legions had used similar formations 1,500 years earlier. Warfare evolved slower than people imagined. What worked in Caesar's time still worked now. Night brought no rest from military readiness. The garrison maintained constant watch, rotating guards through 4-hour shifts that left everyone perpetually tired. Prussian raiders favoured darkness for attacks, knowing Christian soldiers were less effective when exhausted and half-blind. The fortress had been probed 3 times since Heinrich's arrival, testing defences, looking for weaknesses, killing sentries when opportunities arose. The war never truly paused. A major raid came on a moonless night in early May. 50 Prussian warriors attacked the eastern palisade with fire arrows and axes, trying to burn through wooden defences before the garrison could respond. The alarm bells woke Heinrich from dead sleep. He fumbled for armour in the darkness, heart hammering, hands shaking as he tried to buckle straps correctly. By the time he reached the walls, the fight was already half over. The Prussians had set one section of palisade ablaze, the dry timber catching quickly despite recent rain. Defenders threw buckets of water from the well while archers shot at shapes moving in the darkness beyond the fire's glow. Heinrich knocked an arrow with hands that barely responded to commands, drew, released toward nothing visible. Whether he hit anything was unknowable. The chaos made accurate shooting impossible. The raiders withdrew after 20 minutes, having accomplished their goal of disrupting the garrison's sleep and proving they could strike at will. The fire was contained before spreading, but the damaged section would require days of repair. 2 Christian soldiers died from arrow shot during the confusion. 5 more suffered burns fighting the blaze. The Prussians lost no one, disappearing into forests they knew intimately while Christian forces stumbled through unfamiliar darkness. Commander Friedrich addressed the garrison at dawn with cold fury. The raid was embarrassing, proof the fortress defences had weaknesses that needed correction. He ordered doubled watches, cleared vegetation for 200 yards around the walls, and established patrol routes to prevent future approaches. The measures would help but couldn't eliminate the fundamental problem. The Prussians were fighting for their homes on familiar ground, while Christians occupied hostile territory they'd never truly control. Heinrich spent the next week felling trees beyond the fortress walls, clearing sight lines that would give defenders more warning of approaching attacks. The labour was back-breaking, swinging axes until his shoulders screamed protest, dragging logs through mud that sucked at boots. Knights worked alongside conscripts, the order's egalitarianism extending to unpleasant labour if not to actual authority. Everyone sweated equally, even if some gave orders and others followed them. The cleared land revealed how close the wilderness pressed against Christian occupation. Beyond 200 yards of stumps and mud lay forests so thick you couldn't see 50 feet. Prussian scouts could be watching from those shadows right now, counting defenders, noting patrol patterns, planning the next raid. The frontier existed wherever Christian axes stopped cutting, where wilderness began its patient work of reclaiming conquered ground. Sunday brought the only break in military routine, Mass that lasted 2 hours, sermons describing the Crusade's theological necessity, and afternoon rest that felt decadent after 6 days of constant labour. Heinrich used the free time to write letters he knew would never reach recipients. He described life at Balga without mentioning the dungeons, the executions, the moral compromises that accumulated like unpaid debts. His family would imagine him doing God's work, converting pagans through noble example. They'd never know he was a cog in a machine designed for systematic destruction. The confessions Heinrich heard other knights make revealed the psychological toll of frontier service. Men admitted to nightmares about burning villages, guilt over killing children, rage at being used by an organisation that cared nothing for their souls. The priest offered formulaic absolution. Your violence serves God's purpose. Baptizing pagans justifies any method. Doubt is Satan's weapon against holy work. The religious justifications grew thinner with each repetition, words losing meaning until only sounds remained. Heinrich confessed his own doubts to a priest who looked too young to have earned his position. The priest responded with practice phrases about faith being tested, about God working through imperfect instruments, about the nobility of their cause. None of it addressed Heinrich's actual crisis. He didn't doubt God's existence, but questioned whether God endorsed what the order did in his name. The distinction seemed important, but the priest couldn't or wouldn't engage with it. The campaign's official start was scheduled for mid-May, when weather would be dry enough for large-scale troop movements, but early enough to complete objectives before autumn. Messengers arrived from other fortresses confirming coordination. 5 separate columns would advance simultaneously into different regions, preventing Prussian forces from concentrating against a single threat. The strategy was sound, the resources adequate, the outcome nearly certain. The order had transformed crusading into a military science with predictable results. Heinrich prepared his equipment with the thoroughness Otto had drilled into the squad. He oiled his mail until every ring moved freely. He sharpened his sword until the edge would slice paper. He checked his horse's hooves for stones and splits that could lame the animal mid-campaign. The attention to detail was survival strategy. Small failures cascaded into catastrophes when fighting began. The night before departure, the entire garrison assembled for a final mass. The priest called down God's blessing on the upcoming campaign, invoking saints who specialized in warfare, promising paradise to any who died fighting pagans. The words washed over Heinrich like rain, present but leaving no impression. He'd stopped believing the crusade was about salvation. He fought now because vows bound him, because the alternative was desertion and death, because he'd trapped himself in an organization that consumed men and called the process holy. The white cloak felt heavier than the armour underneath it. The black cross marked him as the Order's property, a weapon aimed at people whose only crime was being born in the wrong place, worshipping the wrong gods. Heinrich had become exactly what he'd feared when doubt first crept in. A killer justified by theology he no longer believed, committed to violence he couldn't stop, complicit in genocide disguised as missionary work. The transformation was complete. Tomorrow, the killing would begin. The army departed Balga on a morning thick with fog that turned men into shadows and horses into ghosts. 300 knights formed the armoured corps, their white cloaks appearing spectral in the grey light. 800 infantry followed, mercenaries who'd sold their souls for silver, and conscripts who'd had no choice in the matter. The baggage train stretched a mile behind, wagons groaning under supplies meant to sustain the force for 3 months of wilderness campaigning. This wasn't a raid, but an invasion, organised violence intended to permanently expand Christian territory. Heinrich rode in the middle ranks where inexperienced knights belonged, surrounded by veterans who'd learned that survival meant avoiding both the glory-seeking vanguard and the vulnerable rearguard. Otto commanded their squad with gestures rather than words, conserving energy for the weeks ahead. The destrier beneath Heinrich moved with the resigned patience of an animal that had carried armoured men into horror before and expected to do so again. The column advanced northeast into marshlands that had no roads, only game trails and paths known to local guides. The baptized Prussians leading the army moved with visible reluctance, knowing they were guiding invaders toward their own people's destruction. The Order had made their choice simple: betray your tribe or die with them. Most chose survival over solidarity, a calculation Heinrich understood intimately. He'd made the same decision when he took his vows. The landscape was hostility made geography. Bogs concealed beneath innocent-looking grass swallowed men who stepped wrong. Clouds of biting insects rose from stagnant water, seeking any exposed skin. The trees grew so densely that sunlight barely penetrated, creating perpetual twilight even at midday. This was terrain that fought invaders as effectively as any army, killing through exhaustion and disease before combat began. The first Prussian village appeared on the second day, a cluster of longhouses surrounded by cultivated fields and defensive earthworks. Smoke from cooking fires revealed occupation before scouts confirmed numbers. Perhaps 200 inhabitants, including warriors, women, children, and elderly. The settlement had survived decades of Christian pressure through isolation, but the Order's expansion had finally reached them. Their luck had expired. Commander Friedrich ordered the village surrounded before the inhabitants could flee or organize defense. Knights sealed the northern approach while mercenaries closed from the east and west. The southern route deliberately remained open, a gap in the encirclement designed to channel refugees toward prepared ambush positions. The tactic was refined through years of practice, turning military science into mechanized slaughter. The assault began without warning or offered terms. Archers launched fire arrows into thatched roofs, while infantry charged the earthwork defences. The Prussians responded with desperate courage, warriors fighting to buy time for families to escape through the intentionally opened southern gap. They died defending homes that were already lost, buying minutes for people running towards soldiers hidden in the forest. The entire strategy was predatory genius. Heinrich's squad remained in reserve during the initial assault, watching as professional killers demonstrated their craft. Mercenaries scaled earthworks with practiced efficiency, spears punching through leather armour and flesh with equal ease. The screaming started immediately. Prussian warriors dying, women trying to protect children, the elderly too slow to run. The sounds were primal, identical across languages and cultures. Terror and agony needed no translation. The refugees fleeing south ran directly into the ambush Friedrich had positioned. Knights on horseback cut them down in a clearing 200 yards from the burning village. The killing was systematic, efficient, and utterly one-sided. Armoured cavalry against unarmoured civilians fleeing in panic. It wasn't combat. It was harvest. Humans reduced to crops being gathered by men who'd perfected the technique through repetition. Heinrich's squad received orders to pursue stragglers who'd scattered into the forest during the ambush. Otto led them along a creek where muddy footprints revealed a family's desperate flight. 2 adults, 3 children based on track sizes. They found them a mile downstream, hiding in a hollow beneath tree roots. The father tried to fight with a wood-cutting axe. Otto killed him with a single sword thrust through the throat. The mother grabbed for her children. A mercenary split her skull with a mace. The children were maybe 5, 7, and 9 years old. They stared at the knights with incomprehension that transcended terror, unable to process why armoured strangers had murdered their parents. Protocol was clear. Children could be baptised and given to Christian settlers as servants, essentially slaves with religious justification. But Otto was practical about resource management. 3 more mouths to feed, 3 potential future enemies, 3 witnesses to atrocity who might seek revenge. He killed them quickly, efficiently, without emotion or hesitation. Heinrich vomited in the bushes after, his body rejecting what his mind couldn't process. He'd known intellectually that the Crusade killed civilians. Seeing it happen, participating in child murder, feeling blood spray across his face, knowledge and experience were entirely different categories of horror. Otto waited for him to finish puking, then made clear this was the work. This was what Heinrich had volunteered for when he took his vows. No one forced him to join. He'd chosen this. The village burned through the afternoon, smoke visible for miles. The message was intentional. See what happens to those who resist, who worship false gods, who refuse baptism. The order wanted other settlements to surrender peacefully, to accept conversion rather than annihilation. The strategy sometimes worked. More often it stiffened resistance, tribes deciding that death fighting was preferable to death submitting. Either outcome served the order's purposes. Willing converts or corpses, both resulted in Christian control. The army camped that night in the razed village, sleeping among foundations and bodies not yet cold. Priests moved through the ruins, blessing the ground, consecrating what had been pagan territory into Christian soil. The transformation was supposed to be spiritual but felt entirely political. Legal justification for conquest, baptism retroactively applied to land that couldn't consent or resist. The religious theatre barely masked the imperial project underneath. Heinrich lay awake listening to sounds he'd never noticed before. The creak of cooling embers, the rustle of scavengers investigating corpses, the murmur of soldiers discussing the day's violence with the casualness of farmers reviewing harvest yields. 53 Prussians killed, the unofficial count reported. Maybe a dozen escaped into the wilderness where they'd either die slowly or reach allied tribes with news of the invasion. 0 Christian casualties. The numbers would be reported to Marienburg as evidence of the campaign's success. The column pressed deeper into Prussian territory over the following week, destroying 2 more settlements with practiced efficiency. The pattern was consistent: surround, assault, kill or capture everyone, consecrate the ground, move forward. The army became a machine converting pagan land into Christian territory through systematic depopulation. Villages that had existed for centuries disappeared in afternoons, their inhabitants erased so thoroughly that within a generation no one would remember they'd ever lived. The lack of organised resistance worried Friedrich more than opposition would have. Prussian tribes were massing somewhere, gathering forces for a counterattack against the dispersed Christian columns. The question wasn't whether they'd strike, but when and where. The order's strategy relied on superior equipment and training, overwhelming numerical disadvantages, but only if they could force battle on favourable terms. If the Prussians chose the battlefield, Christian advantages diminished considerably. Disease struck the army on the campaign's 10th day. Dysentery spread through the conscripts first, then jumped to mercenaries and finally reached the knights. Men shat blood and water, losing strength so rapidly they couldn't walk. The surgeons had no effective treatment beyond prayer and bleeding patients who were already dying from fluid loss. 15 men died in 3 days. Their bodies were buried in shallow graves that scavengers would excavate within hours. The water sources were compromised, either by Prussian sabotage or natural contamination from the army's own waste. Every stream was suspect, every pond potentially fatal. The force relied on beer and weak wine for hydration, but supplies dwindled faster than anticipated. The quartermaster reported they had enough for 3 more weeks at current consumption. After that, the army would have to drink from local sources and accept the casualties that followed. Heinrich developed a cough that progressed from annoying to concerning within days. He wasn't vomiting or experiencing dysentery, but the persistent hack suggested respiratory infection, spreading through soldiers living in close quarters. A dozen knights showed similar symptoms. Brother Conrad dismissed it as campaign plague, the inevitable result of breathing air contaminated by burning villages, rotting bodies, and too many humans pressed together. Most would survive, some wouldn't. The order would replace casualties and continue the mission. The first major fortification appeared after 2 weeks of campaigning. A Prussian hill fort commanded high ground overlooking a river crossing. Earthwork walls reinforced with timber palisades creating defences that couldn't be quickly overrun. Smoke from multiple fires indicated substantial occupation. Friedrich estimated 200 warriors plus civilians. This wasn't a village but a military position, a statement that some Prussians intended to resist rather than flee. The order had faced such fortifications dozens of times. The tactics were established through trial and error, refined by success and failure, codified into doctrine. First, surround the position to prevent reinforcement or escape. Second, probe defences to identify weaknesses. Third, construct siege equipment while maintaining pressure. Fourth, assault at the optimal moment using overwhelming force at a single point. The process was methodical, professional, and had predictable timelines. The siege equipment took 4 days to construct. Carpenters built a massive battering ram from a single oak trunk, iron-shod and suspended on a wheeled frame. Engineers assembled 3 catapults capable of launching rocks the size of human heads. Archers prepared thousands of fire arrows designed to ignite thatched roofs inside the fort. Meanwhile, regular infantry probed the defences, drawing fire to deplete the defenders' ammunition stores. Heinrich's squad was assigned to the assault force that would follow the battering ram through the breach. Otto explained the technique with brutal clarity. The ram would smash through the gate or wall section, creating an opening maybe 10 feet wide. The first knights through would face concentrated defensive fire from every archer and spear thrower the Prussians could position. Those first men would probably die. The second wave would climb over their bodies and push deeper into the fort. The third wave would secure the breach and prevent counterattacks. It was calculated sacrifice, spending lives to achieve objectives. The assault began at dawn on the fifth day, time to catch defenders exhausted from overnight watch. The catapults launched rocks that crashed into palisades, splintering timber and crushing anyone behind the walls. Fire arrows arced over defences, trailing smoke like falling stars. The ram advanced under cover of shields locked together into a protective shell, mercenaries pushing the massive frame toward the southern gate, where intelligence suggested the weakest point. Prussian defenders fought with desperate innovation. They dropped rocks from walls onto the ram crew, crushing skulls and breaking bones despite helmets and armour. They poured heated sand between gaps in the shield roof, the burning grains finding every crack in armour to sear flesh underneath. They launched spears with enough force to punch through shields and the men behind them. The defensive tactics were brutal but effective. The ram's advance stalled 50 feet from the gate as casualties mounted. Friedrich committed reserves to protect the ram, fresh infantry replacing dead men without pause. The human cost was irrelevant compared to momentum. If the assault stalled, morale would crack and the siege would drag on for weeks. Better to spend lives now than lose time that would consume resources and create opportunities for Prussian reinforcements. The logic was industrial, warfare as resource management where soldiers were assets to be expended for maximum return. The gate splintered under the ram's 20th impact, timber frame cracking with sounds like breaking bones. The ram crew gave one final push and the entire structure collapsed inward, creating a breach wide enough for 3 armoured knights to enter abreast. The first wave charged into a killing zone where every Prussian weapon focused on the narrow opening. They died exactly as predicted. Arrows in the neck and face, spears through gaps in armour, axes that split helms and the skulls underneath. Heinrich was in the third wave, pushing through the breach over bodies still twitching. The interior was chaos. Smoke from burning buildings, screaming wounded, the clash of weapons on shields and armour. A Prussian warrior swung an axe at his head. Heinrich blocked with his shield, felt the impact shudder through his arm, countered with a thrust that skidded off the man's leather armour. They circled each other, both seeking an opening, both terrified and trying to hide it. The Prussian attacked again, a horizontal swing aimed at Heinrich's ribs. Heinrich stepped into the blow instead of away, accepting a glancing impact in exchange for close distance, where his sword had advantage over the longer axe. He drove his blade up under the warrior's ribcage, felt resistance as steel scraped bone, then the sudden give as the point found organs. The man's eyes went wide with shock and pain. He tried to speak, blood bubbling from his mouth instead of words. Heinrich twisted the blade and withdrew, watching his first kill collapse into the mud. There was no time to process. Another defender came at him, this one with a spear that had reach advantage. Heinrich caught the thrust on his shield, felt the point punch through wood and leather to scrape his forearm. He grabbed the spear shaft with his offhand, yanking the Prussian off balance, then killed him with a descending blow that split the collarbone and continued into the chest. 2 men dead by his hand in 30 seconds. The violence was mechanical, trained responses executing without conscious thought. The fort fell within an hour, resistance collapsing once Christian forces secured the breach and fanned out through the interior. The surviving defenders fought to the death, or killed themselves rather than surrender. Prussian women grabbed weapons and died alongside the warriors. Children too young to fight hid in root cellars and storage buildings, discovered later by soldiers searching for loot. Standard protocol applied: baptism and enslavement, conversion or death, no options beyond submission. The aftermath was organised plunder. Soldiers stripped bodies of anything valuable: bronze jewellery, iron weapons, furs that could be sold in Christian markets. The fort's food stores were confiscated for the army's use, extending campaign duration by precious weeks. The strongest prisoners were chained for transport to coastal markets, where Prussian slaves fetched decent prices. The rest received forced baptism from priests who'd been waiting for precisely this moment. Heinrich sat on the corpse-strewn ground feeling nothing. Not triumph, not guilt, just exhaustion and a vague disconnection from the violence he'd participated in. He'd killed 2 men today, maybe 3 if you counted the children in the forest. He'd crossed a threshold that couldn't be uncrossed. He was a killer now, blooded and functional, exactly what the Order had trained him to become. The transformation should have felt more significant. Instead, it felt like inevitability, like steps in a dance he'd always been moving toward. Otto checked the squad for casualties. Everyone had survived without serious injuries, though several carried minor wounds that would fester if untreated. The sergeant's satisfaction was visible. He'd gotten his men through their first major engagement alive, which improved survival odds for future battles. Experience was currency in medieval warfare, each successful fight increasing the likelihood you'd survive the next. Heinrich had just made his first deposit in an account he'd be drawing from all summer. The captured fort would become a Christian outpost, another link in the Order's expanding network of frontier fortifications. A garrison would occupy it through winter, using it as a base for further raids into unconquered territories. In 5 years, it would be indistinguishable from the Order's older castles, stone walls replacing timber, German settlers farming the surrounding land, a chapel where pagan shrines had stood. The transformation was systematic, proven through decades of colonial expansion. It was also probably irreversible. The Prussians had lost this ground permanently. That night the army camped inside the captured fort, sleeping behind walls they'd breached that morning. The dead had been thrown into mass graves outside the palisade. Prussians buried with minimal ceremony, Christians interred with prayers they'd probably appreciate more than actual salvation. The distinction mattered to the priests who needed to believe Christian deaths had meaning. To Heinrich, corpses were just corpses. Death didn't care about your theology. The army pushed northeast beyond any previous Christian penetration, entering wilderness that had never seen a cross or heard Latin prayers. The captured fort sat 3 days behind them now, garrisoned by 50 men who'd drawn the unlucky duty of holding isolated ground, until reinforcements arrived in autumn. The main force continued deeper into terra incognita, following rivers that had no names on Christian maps and trails that only the reluctant Prussian guides could navigate. Every mile increased the distance from safety and supplies, stretching logistics until something would inevitably snap. The forest changed character as they advanced. Trees grew older, thicker, their canopy so dense that moss covered everything in perpetual dampness. The undergrowth thinned in the shade, creating cathedral-like spaces between massive trunks. This was primeval woodland, unchanged since before Rome fell, the kind of ancient forest that had covered all of Europe before axes and civilization cleared it. The Prussians considered these depths sacred, home to spirits and gods that Christians claimed didn't exist. Heinrich felt the weight of the place, a presence that had nothing to do with theology and everything to do with being human in a landscape that predated humanity. The supply situation deteriorated faster than Friedrich's calculations had predicted. Wagons broke axles on terrain never meant for wheeled vehicles. Pack animals went lame from stone bruises and had to be slaughtered for meat that barely replaced the grain they'd been carrying. The beer ran out completely, forcing soldiers to drink from streams despite the dysentery risk. Men were consuming more calories through sheer physical exertion than the reduced rations provided. Hunger became a constant companion, gnawing at discipline and morale equally. Disease spread through the army like fire through dry timber. The dysentery that had killed conscripts now claimed mercenaries and knights. Men collapsed mid-march, unable to continue, left beside the trail with a prayer and no realistic hope of survival. Heinrich's cough worsened into something that brought up bloody phlegm. Half the force showed similar respiratory symptoms. The surgeons bled patients until they were too weak to stand, convinced that draining bad humours would restore health. The treatment killed as effectively as the illness. A mercenary sergeant named Bruno succumbed to fever on the campaign's 20th day. He'd survived 15 years of warfare across Europe only to die shitting himself in a Prussian marsh, killed by contaminated water rather than enemy action. His men buried him in a shallow grave and divided his possessions without ceremony. Death had stopped being remarkable. The army had lost 60 men to disease in 3 weeks, twice the casualties from actual combat. The wilderness was defeating them more effectively than any human enemy. The Prussian guides began disappearing. One vanished during a night watch. 2 more slipped away during a river crossing. The order's threat of executing their families couldn't motivate men who'd already written off everyone they loved. Friedrich ordered the remaining guides chained at night and watched constantly during marches. The precaution revealed the fundamental truth. They were deep in hostile territory, dependent on forced cooperation from people who hated them, without reliable intelligence about terrain or enemy positions. The strategic situation was deteriorating from challenging to catastrophic. Signs of Prussian military presence multiplied. Scouts found recently abandoned camps where dozens of warriors had gathered. Trees bore carved symbols that the remaining guides claimed were territorial markers or religious signs, though they might equally be tactical communications. Tracks suggested organised patrols shadowing the Christian column, observing but not engaging. Friedrich recognised the pattern from previous campaigns. The Prussians were massing, choosing their moment, waiting for Christian forces to become sufficiently weakened and dispersed before striking. The army established a fortified camp beside a river that provided water and one flank of natural defence. Earthwork walls went up with the speed of experienced campaigners who understood that good defences meant survival. Palisades followed, timber cut from the surrounding forest. Within 2 days, they'd created a temporary fortress capable of withstanding anything short of a major assault. But the position was static, defensive, and fundamentally vulnerable. They were supposed to be conquering territory, not cowering behind walls waiting for attack. Heinrich's squad drew perimeter patrol duty, riding a circuit around the camp to detect approaching enemies. The work was nerve-shredding. Every shadow could hide attackers, every sound might be the prelude to ambush. They found Prussian observation posts in the forests, abandoned minutes before arrival, as if the enemy knew Christian patrol routes in advance. The psychological warfare was effective. The constant sense of being watched, of never being safe, ground down morale more efficiently than direct combat. A foraging party sent to hunt game returned 3 men short. The missing soldiers were found 2 days later, crucified on trees a mile from camp. They'd been tortured extensively before death, their bodies marked with cuts and burns that served no purpose beyond sending messages. The Prussians wanted Christians to know that captured soldiers would suffer before dying, that mercy was not among the available options. The psychological impact was immediate. Men became terrified of being taken alive, which meant they'd fight to the death even in hopeless situations. The main Prussian attack came on a morning thick with fog that reduced visibility to 30 yards. They hit the eastern perimeter with 500 warriors, organised and equipped better than any force the order had previously encountered. These weren't village defenders or isolated warbands, but a coordinated army with tactical discipline and battlefield experience. They'd been fighting Christians for 4 decades and had learned every lesson through blood and survival. The assault began with a barrage of arrows and javelins that punished defenders before melee engagement. Christian archers returned fire blindly into the fog, wasting ammunition on targets they couldn't confirm. The Prussians used the visibility cover to approach the earthwork walls, bringing scaling ladders and grappling hooks. They were imitating Christian siege tactics, turning the Order's own methods against them with modifications for their equipment and training. Heinrich's position on the eastern wall put him directly in the attack's path. Prussian warriors swarmed up ladders with terrifying speed, weapons swinging before defenders could properly respond. A massive warrior in studded leather armour came over the wall 3 feet from Heinrich, wielding a 2-handed axe that split a mercenary's shield and arm with a single blow. Heinrich thrust his sword at the man's exposed side, felt the blade skip off hardened leather, adjusted, and drove the point into the armpit where armour was thin. The warrior bellowed in pain but didn't fall, swinging the axe one-handed in a horizontal arc that forced Heinrich backward. Otto appeared from the side, his sword taking the wounded Prussian in the throat. Blood sprayed in arterial pulses as the warrior collapsed. 2 more attackers were already climbing over the palisade. The defence was crumbling under weight of numbers and aggression that matched Christian ferocity. For the first time in the campaign, the Order's troops faced opponents who were equally committed, equally well trained, and fighting for something more valuable than wages or religious duty. They were defending their homeland against invaders. Friedrich committed the reserve knights from the centre, armoured cavalry charging along the inner wall to reinforce collapsing positions. The weight of mounted warriors in full plate turned the tide through sheer mass and momentum. Prussians were trampled, speared, or cut down by swords swung from horseback with gravity's assistance. The assault faltered as casualties mounted faster than replacements could climb the walls. After 40 minutes of brutal close combat, the attackers withdrew into the fog, leaving 200 dead or dying on the earthworks. Christian casualties were severe. 30 knights killed, twice that number wounded seriously enough to be combat ineffective. The mercenary infantry had lost over 100 men. Conscripts died in such numbers that no one bothered counting. The camp's defensive perimeter was breached in 3 places, only held through desperate counterattacks that had cost lives to regain yards of ground. The victory was Pyrrhic. They'd survived but couldn't sustain many more such engagements without total collapse. The wounded overwhelmed the surgeon's capacity to provide even primitive care. Men lay in rows, bleeding from wounds the medical staff couldn't properly treat. The lucky ones died quickly from blood loss or shock. The unlucky lingered for days, succumbing to infections that turned minor cuts into death sentences. Heinrich watched a knight he'd trained beside die from an arm wound that had seemed survivable. The infection spread until the man was delirious with fever, screaming about demons before finally going silent. Disease exploded through the cramped, unsanitary conditions of men packed behind walls with inadequate latrines and contaminated water. The dysentery that had been manageable became epidemic. Respiratory infections progressed to pneumonia. Wounds that might have healed in clean conditions festered in the filth and humidity. More men were dying from illness than from the battle, the enemy's real weapon revealed as the environment itself rather than Prussian steel. Friedrich convened his senior knights to discuss options that range from bad to catastrophic. They could advance deeper, searching for the Prussian main force in terrain that favoured defenders and ambushers. They could hold position, waiting for the disease to run its course while supplies dwindled and enemy forces grew stronger. Or they could retreat, admitting defeat and abandoning the summer's objectives. Every option led to failure. The question was which failure they could survive. The decision was retreat, though Friedrich called it tactical reposition to preserve morale. They'd withdraw to the captured hill fort, consolidate forces, and reassess strategy with winter approaching. The admission that the campaign had failed was implicit but unspoken. The order would present the summer's results as success: territory captured, pagans killed, Christian presence expanded. The reality of soldiers dying in marshes while Prussian forces remained undefeated would be minimized in official reports. The withdrawal began at night to minimize Prussian observation, the army abandoning their fortified camp in darkness. They left behind everything non-essential: spare equipment, sick men too weak to march, the bodies of comrades who died that afternoon. The abandoned camp would be a gift to pursuing enemies, filled with weapons and supplies the Christians couldn't carry. But mobility was survival, and survival required cruel calculations about what and who to abandon. The retreat was a fighting withdrawal, Prussian forces harassing the column constantly. They'd strike the rearguard, kill a dozen men, then fade into the forest before counterattacks could develop. The tactics were guerrilla warfare refined through desperation, small forces causing disproportionate casualties through superior knowledge of terrain and ruthless efficiency. Every mile cost Christian lives, each day's march leaving more bodies on the trail behind them. Heinrich's horse went lame on the second day of retreat, forcing him to march on foot with infantry, who resented the armoured knights sharing their misery. The armour that had seemed empowering now felt like torture. 70 pounds of metal and leather grinding against raw skin, making every step an ordeal. He discarded pieces to reduce weight, first the leg armour, then parts of the coat of plates, until he wore barely more protection than a common soldier. The transformation from knight to desperate survivor took 48 hours. A rearguard detachment of 20 mercenaries was overrun by Prussian forces during a river crossing. Heinrich heard the screams from half a mile ahead, recognized the sounds of men dying badly. The column didn't stop or turn back. Rearguard troops understood their role: delay enemies regardless of cost, buy time with lives. Their sacrifice gained the main force maybe 30 minutes, distance that might mean the difference between survival and annihilation. The calculus was brutal but mathematically sound. They reached the captured hill fort after 8 days of retreat, having lost another 100 men to combat disease and exhaustion. The garrison that had been left to hold the position looked shocked by the main force's condition. The elite army that had marched past weeks earlier had returned as a broken column of sick, wounded, traumatized survivors. The summer campaign that was supposed to expand Christian control had instead demonstrated the limits of the order's power. Prussia had defeated them not through military genius, but through simple geographic and epidemiological reality. The fort's supplies were inadequate for the swollen garrison. Friedrich sent messengers to Balga requesting immediate reinforcement and resupply, though everyone knew winter would arrive before significant help could reach them. The sick needed medicine that didn't exist. The wounded required care beyond medieval surgery's capacity. The healthy men were exhausted, demoralized, and increasingly doubtful about the Crusade's divine endorsement. When God's chosen warriors died from contaminated water and infected wounds, theological certainty became harder to maintain. Heinrich's fever broke on his third day in the fort, leaving him weak but lucid. He'd lost perhaps 20 pounds, his armour no longer fitting properly over wasted muscle. The cough persisted, bringing up blood-streaked phlegm that the surgeons claimed was good, evidence that bad humours were leaving his body. More likely it indicated lung damage from infection, scarring that would never fully heal. He'd carry this injury for life, assuming he lived long enough for that to matter. The strategic situation was untenable. They held a single fort in enemy territory, surrounded by hostile forces, supplied by a single road that Prussians raided constantly. Winter was approaching, which would make that supply line even more precarious. The campaign objectives were abandoned, the summer's conquest reduced to this one fortification held at the cost of hundreds of Christian lives. The order would call it a foothold, a base for future expansion. Heinrich saw it clearly as a failure that pride prevented from being called what it was. The mood in the fort was grim, men contemplating a winter of privation and constant danger. The optimism that had characterized the campaign's beginning had died somewhere in the marshes, killed by disease and Prussian efficiency. What remained was endurance, the stubborn refusal to admit defeat, the institutional momentum of an organization that never acknowledged mistakes. They would hold this fort because the alternative was admitting the crusade was unwinnable, and that admission would undermine the entire project's justification. Heinrich sat on the fort's walls, looking out at the forest where Prussian warriors watched and waited. The enemy was patient, content to let winter do their work, knowing that time favoured defenders while destroying invaders. The order had underestimated them, mistaking technological advantage for inevitable victory. The Prussians had proven that determination, knowledge of terrain, and tactical flexibility could neutralize armor and organization. The Crusade's outcome was no longer certain. Heinrich wasn't sure it had ever been. The supply convoy from Balga arrived in late September, 40 wagons escorted by 100 fresh troops who hadn't yet learned what Prussia did to Christian optimism. They brought grain, salted meat, replacement weapons, and letters from commanders who still believed the campaign could be salvaged. The convoy's captain reported that 2 other order columns operating in different regions had suffered similar setbacks. One completely destroyed in an ambush, another forced back to coastal fortresses after losing half its strength. The summer offensive had failed across all fronts simultaneously, revealing systematic problems rather than isolated misfortunes. Heinrich barely recognized the new arrivals as versions of himself from 6 months earlier. They wore clean surcoats and polished armor, spoke eagerly about crusading glory, and treated the bedraggled garrison with poorly concealed disdain. The veterans ignored them with the weary patience of men who knew that Prussia would teach lessons that words couldn't convey. Experience was the only valid instructor in this war. Everything else was propaganda. The fort settled into winter routine, preparations for months of isolation and hardship. Work parties cut firewood in quantities that seemed excessive until veterans explained that heating stone buildings through Baltic winters consumed forests. The smithy operated constantly, repairing equipment damaged during the summer and creating stockpiles of arrowheads and spear points. Hunters ranged into the forest despite the risk, taking game to supplement monotonous salted rations. Every activity focused on survival rather than conquest, the crusade temporarily suspended by weather and strategic reality. Disease continued killing with the persistence of a professional executioner. 30 men died in October alone, their bodies buried in ground that was beginning to freeze. The cramped conditions inside the fort prevented any meaningful quarantine, sick men coughing on healthy ones in shared barracks. The surgeons had given up pretending their treatments worked, resorting to prayer as the only intervention with documented success rates, namely 0%, but at least it didn't make things worse like bleeding and purging did. Heinrich's respiratory infection settled into chronic status, a permanent cough that brought up bloody phlegm every morning. He'd learned to sleep sitting upright because lying flat triggered coughing fits that lasted hours. Brother Conrad suffered worse symptoms, wheezing with every breath, his face grey with the oxygen deprivation that would eventually kill him. They'd both requested confession multiple times, convinced death was imminent, but somehow continued surviving through sheer, stubborn refusal to give Prussia the satisfaction. The garrison's relationship with the local Christian settlers revealed the Crusade's colonial underpinnings with uncomfortable clarity. German farmers who'd been granted conquered land paid the order's tax collectors while complaining about Prussian raids that destroyed crops and burned homesteads. They wanted the knights to provide security, but resented the heavy tribute demanded in exchange. The settlers had discovered that the order's protection was conditional, expensive, and often arrived too late to prevent disaster. Their loyalty was pragmatic rather than genuine, based on calculations about which side would help them survive winter. A settler delegation arrived in November requesting military assistance against Prussian raiders. Friedrich refused, explaining that the garrison lacked sufficient strength to risk patrols beyond the fort's immediate vicinity. The settlers argued that without protection, they'd abandon their farms and return to Poland, leaving the order without the agricultural base that justified territorial claims. Friedrich's response was coldly practical. Deserters would be hunted and hanged as oath-breakers. The settlers had accepted land grants in exchange for military service obligations. The order would enforce those contracts regardless of circumstances. The settlers left with expressions that promised future betrayal. Heinrich understood their calculation perfectly. They'd cooperate as long as the order could enforce compliance, but the moment Christian power weakened sufficiently, they'd switch allegiances or simply flee. The colonial project depended on military force strong enough to suppress both Prussians and resentful Christian subjects. The summer's failures had demonstrated that such force wasn't guaranteed, that the order's control was more fragile than propaganda suggested. Prussian raiders tested the fort's defences with increasing boldness as winter deepened. Small parties would approach within bow range, launch arrows at sentries, then disappear before retaliation could organise. The attacks killed maybe 1 or 2 Christians per raid, but created constant tension that prevented rest. Guards had to remain alert through 4-hour watches in temperatures that caused frostbite in minutes. The psychological warfare was sophisticated, designed to exhaust defenders without risking significant Prussian casualties. A major raid came during a blizzard in early December. 60 Prussian warriors attacked the southern wall under cover of wind-driven snow that reduced visibility to arm's length. They nearly succeeded in breaching the gate before alarm bells roused sleeping defenders. The fighting was desperate and disorganized, men stumbling through snowdrifts while trying to identify friend from enemy in whiteout conditions. The Prussians withdrew after 30 minutes, having killed 8 Christians and proven the fort was vulnerable even in weather that should have prevented military operations. Friedrich ordered doubled watches and mandatory armour wearing even during sleep. The measures increased security but accelerated the garrison's physical deterioration. Men sleeping in mail developed pressure sores that infected. The constant vigilance produced exhaustion so profound that guards fell asleep standing, waking only when they collapsed. The crusade was grinding down everyone involved, Christian and Prussian alike, through attrition that had no dramatic battles or decisive victories, just endless, incremental destruction of human capacity. Heinrich drew night watch on the winter solstice, the longest darkness of the year. He stood on frozen ramparts watching forests that concealed unknown numbers of enemies planning unknown attacks. The cold was absolute, penetrating every layer of clothing and armour until he couldn't feel his feet or hands. 4 hours of this duty, then 4 hours of fitful sleep in a drafty barracks, then 4 more hours of watch. The cycle repeated endlessly, each day identical to the last, winter compressing time until weeks blurred together into indistinguishable suffering. Brother Conrad died on a January morning, his lungs finally failing after months of progressive deterioration. He'd been Heinrich's guide through the realities of crusading, the veteran who'd explained the gap between propaganda and practice. His death was quiet, unremarkable, just another casualty in a war that killed more men through disease than combat. The priest who'd performed Conrad's final confession described him as dying in God's service, faithful to his vows. Heinrich knew better. Conrad had died trapped by an organization he'd stopped believing in, unable to leave because desertion meant damnation. His death was waste, not sacrifice. The fort's population declined steadily through winter. Disease claimed 3 or 4 men weekly. Prussian raids added occasional casualties. 2 soldiers simply disappeared, presumed to have deserted despite the risks. By February, the garrison numbered barely 300 effective fighters, half the force that had retreated there in autumn. Friedrich sent increasingly desperate messages to Balga requesting reinforcements, but winter made the supply roads nearly impassable. The isolated fort was dying slowly, garrison and crusade bleeding out together in the frozen wilderness. Spring arrived with false promise, temperatures rising enough to thaw mud but not enough to make military operations feasible. The fort's supplies were critically depleted. Hunters had cleared game from the surrounding forests. The grain stores would last maybe 6 more weeks. After that, starvation would accomplish what disease and Prussian raids had begun. The garrison faced a choice between abandoning the position they'd held through winter or dying slowly of hunger. Pride and institutional momentum argued for staying. Survival argued for retreat. Heinrich spent his 19th birthday on the fort's walls, marking the occasion by counting the months since he'd taken his vows. 17 months of service. It felt like decades. He'd aged in ways that had nothing to do with years. The physical deterioration from illness and hardship, the psychological damage from violence and moral compromise, the spiritual death of watching belief systems collapse under the weight of their own contradictions. The boy who'd entered Marienburg believing in holy missions no longer existed. In his place stood a cynical soldier who knew exactly what the crusade was and could do nothing to escape it. A relief column arrived in April, 200 fresh troops with supply wagons that meant survival for another campaign season. Friedrich greeted them with visible relief mixed with guilt. The new arrivals would experience the same hell the current garrison had endured, losing their illusions and possibly their lives to Prussia's endless resistance. The cycle was perpetual, idealistic recruits arriving, brutal reality destroying them, survivors becoming bitter veterans who'd watch the next generation make the same journey. The machine consumed people and called the process crusading. The Order's regional commander arrived with the relief force, a political knight named Hartmann, who'd spent minimal time in actual combat zones. He inspected the fort with the critical eye of someone evaluating property, rather than a military position held at tremendous cost. His questions focused on why the summer campaign had failed, why casualties had been so high, why objectives hadn't been achieved. Friedrich's explanations about disease, terrain, and Prussian effectiveness were dismissed as excuses. Hartmann made clear that headquarters considered the summer a failure of leadership, rather than strategic miscalculation. Friedrich was removed from command and reassigned to administrative duties at a coastal fortress, effectively demoted for telling truths that contradicted official narratives. His replacement was a younger knight named Rudolf, who distinguished himself in tournament combat, but had never led men in actual warfare. The Order was promoting political reliability over battlefield experience, choosing commanders who'd report what headquarters wanted to hear, rather than accurate assessments. The decision virtually guaranteed future disasters. The new command structure immediately planned another summer offensive, ignoring the previous year's lessons. Rudolf was convinced that proper discipline and aggressive tactics would succeed where Friedrich's caution had failed. He dismissed disease as a leadership problem. Weak commanders allowed men to become sick through insufficient morale. He viewed Prussian effectiveness as temporary luck that would collapse under sustained pressure. His confidence was absolute, unshakable, and completely detached from reality. Heinrich recognized the type from Marienburg, true believers who'd never had faith tested by evidence. The spring campaign began in May with Rudolf leading 300 knights deep into Prussian territory, following nearly the same route the previous summer's disaster had taken. Heinrich marched with them because vows left no choice, watching Rudolf make identical mistakes with identical certainty. They'd burn villages, kill civilians, claim victories while disease hollowed out their strength. The Prussians would watch, wait, then strike when Christian forces were sufficiently weakened. The outcome was predictable with depressing accuracy. But this time, Heinrich wasn't naive enough to hope for different results. He understood the Crusade's true nature now. Not a religious mission, but an imperial project using faith as justification, sustained by institutional momentum despite consistent failures. The Order would continue launching campaigns because admitting the Crusade was unwinnable would undermine the entire organization's purpose. They'd keep sending young men into Prussia to die, keep claiming divine mandate for conquest, keep building their territorial empire regardless of cost in lives or morality. Heinrich confessed to a priest before the campaign departed, admitting doubts about the Crusade's righteousness. The priest responded with familiar justifications. The Crusade served God's purpose. Pagan souls were being saved. Temporary suffering enabled eternal salvation. Heinrich listened without belief, going through motions that had become pure ritual. He'd stopped looking for spiritual guidance from men who'd rationalized atrocity into divine will. The confession was performance, obligation fulfilled without expectation of absolution. The morning of departure, Heinrich put on armour that no longer fit properly over his damaged body, mounted a horse that wasn't the destrier he'd started with, and took his position in a column of men marching toward predictable suffering. The white cloak with its black cross marked him as a Teutonic Knight, property of an organisation he despised, committed to violence he knew was unjustified, trapped by vows that superseded personal morality. He'd become exactly what he'd feared, a weapon aimed by people who didn't care about the damage they caused. The army marched northeast into wilderness that had already proven it could destroy them. Behind them, the fort that had barely survived winter would be garrisoned by men who'd endure the same horrors. Ahead lay Prussian forces preparing to resist another invasion, with the determination of people fighting for survival. The Crusade would continue because stopping would require admitting it had failed, and institutional pride prevented that admission. So more men would die, more villages would burn, more atrocities would be committed in God's name. Heinrich rode toward another summer of killing, knowing exactly what awaited, unable to change anything. The tragedy wasn't that the Crusade was brutal. Medieval warfare was universally brutal. The tragedy was that it was pointless, violence serving no purpose beyond organizational self-justification. Young men dying to perpetuate a system that would consume replacements with equal indifference. He was complicit now, aware but powerless. One more soldier marching toward familiar horrors because the alternative was desertion, excommunication, and death. The machine was larger than any individual. It ground forward regardless. The campaigns blurred together after the second summer, each year repeating the previous with variations too minor to matter. Heinrich survived 1245, then 1246, then 1247, accumulating scars both visible and hidden. His left shoulder carried an axe wound that had healed crooked, limiting his range of motion permanently. His lungs rattled with every breath, the infection from his first campaign having progressed into chronic damage no medieval medicine could address. His hands showed burns from Greek fire that had splashed through a visor gap during a siege. The body that had entered Prussia young and intact was being systematically destroyed, piece by piece, season by season. The order rotated him between frontier fortresses, never leaving him long enough in one place to form attachments that might supersede institutional loyalty. He spent autumn 1247 at a castle called Kreuzberg, winter at Königsberg, spring back at Balga where he'd first experienced combat. Each fortress was identical in function, a stone fist planted in conquered soil, radiating Christian authority through architecture and violence. The garrisons changed, but the work remained constant. Training, patrolling, suppressing resistance, converting or killing pagans, maintaining the machine that ground everything into submission or corpses. The new recruits arriving each spring were indistinguishable from who Heinrich had been, their faces reflecting the same naive conviction he'd once carried. He watched them discover that crusading meant dysentery and frostbite more than glorious combat, saw their faith erode under the weight of moral compromises required daily. Some broke quickly, deserting or going mad. Others adapted, becoming efficient killers who'd learned to disconnect action from conscience. A few maintained their beliefs through increasingly elaborate self-deception. All of them were being consumed by the same machine, processed into tools the order would use until breakage. Otto had died in 1246, killed by an infected wound that turned gangrenous despite amputation of the affected arm. He'd survived countless battles only to die from a cut sustained while training recruits, killed by bacteria rather than enemies. His death bothered Heinrich more than the deaths of men he'd known less well, perhaps because Otto had represented competence in a world of chaos, the veteran who made survival seem possible through skill rather than luck. With him gone, Heinrich understood that experience only delayed the inevitable. Everyone died eventually. The only variable was timing. The Prussian resistance evolved as the years passed, adapting tactics to counter the order's methods, with the innovation of people fighting for existence. They abandoned fixed fortifications that Christian siege techniques could overcome, instead maintaining mobile forces that struck supply lines and isolated garrisons. They'd learned to use winter as a weapon, launching raids during blizzards when Christian troops were most vulnerable. They poisoned wells with dead animals, spread disease through captured prisoners released near order strongholds, and employed psychological warfare that eroded morale as effectively as combat. The Crusade's territorial gains were minimal despite constant warfare. Maps showed expanding Christian control, but the reality was networks of fortresses connected by tenuous supply routes, islands of order authority and a hostile sea of unconquered wilderness. The Prussians hadn't been defeated so much as temporarily pushed back, waiting for opportunities to reclaim lost ground. The war had settled into stalemate. Neither side could win, but neither could afford to lose. Perpetual conflict that destroyed everyone involved without resolving anything. Heinrich participated in the construction of a new fortress in 1248, watching German engineers transform a forested hilltop into a military position over 6 months of brutal labour. Hundreds of conscripted locals and prisoners cut timber, hauled stone, dug foundations while knights supervised and occasionally killed workers who moved too slowly. The fortress rose from nothing through applied cruelty and organisational efficiency, a monument to the order's capacity for transforming human suffering into strategic infrastructure. When completed, it would house 200 men dedicated to pushing Christianity's frontier another 5 miles into Prussia. The dedication ceremony combined religious theatre with political messaging. A bishop arrived from the coast to consecrate the chapel, blessing the fortress as holy ground stolen from pagans. local Christian settlers attended, demonstrating their submission to order authority. Baptized Prussians were paraded as evidence that conversion was possible, proof that the Crusade served God's will rather than German imperial ambitions. The entire performance was orchestrated propaganda, designed to maintain domestic support for an increasingly expensive war that showed no signs of ending. Heinrich stood through the ceremony wearing armour polished for the occasion, presenting the image of a faithful knight devoted to the Crusade's sacred mission. Inside, he felt nothing but contempt for the hypocrisy. The bishop had never campaigned, never killed, never watched disease hollow out men until they died vomiting blood. The settlers attended from fear rather than devotion. The baptized Prussians had converted to avoid enslavement. Everyone participating understood the reality, but maintained the fiction because admitting truth would undermine the system benefiting them. The fortress was named Marienwerder in honor of the Virgin Mary, as if divine association could sanitize the violence required to build it. Within a month of occupation, the garrison launched its first raids into surrounding territory, burning villages and forcing baptisms at sword point. The pattern was established, familiar, and would continue until the fortress was destroyed or the Prussians were extinct. Heinrich participated because vows demanded it, killing people he had no personal enmity toward, because an organization required their submission or death. By 1249, Heinrich commanded his own squad, promoted to sergeant through the simple process of surviving longer than most. He trained new knights with brutal honesty Otto had once shown him, stripping away romantic notions before Prussia could kill them through ignorance. He taught that crusading was administration with violence, that faith was performance, that survival required treating warfare as skilled labour rather than holy mission. Some recruits appreciated the realistic preparation. Others reported him to superiors for insufficient religious devotion. The order tolerated his cynicism because effective veterans were scarce, competence valued over enthusiasm. The campaign season of 1249 brought a new Prussian tactic that revealed how thoroughly they'd learned from decades of conflict. Instead of engaging Christian forces directly, they'd evacuated entire regions ahead of order advances, taking everything movable and burning what remained. The crusaders found empty villages, poisoned wells, forests stripped of game. There was nothing to conquer, no one to convert or kill, no supplies to appropriate. The Prussians had traded territory for time, accepting temporary displacement to deny Christians the resources needed for sustained occupation. Rudolf, still in command despite consistent failures, ordered the army to pursue deeper into evacuated territories. The decision was strategically insane, logistically impossible, and tactically suicidal. Heinrich watched the orders disseminate with the detachment of someone who knew protest were pointless. The order's command structure didn't tolerate dissent, particularly from junior knights regardless of experience. Rudolf would lead them into disaster, men would die, and headquarters would promote another political knight to repeat the cycle. The pursuit lasted 3 weeks before collapsing under its own impossibility. The army outran supply lines, ran out of food, and was forced to slaughter horses for meat. Disease struck with familiar efficiency. Prussian raiders harassed the column constantly, killing stragglers without risking major engagement. The retreat was chaotic, men abandoning equipment to move faster, the wounded left behind with prayers that meant nothing. They stumbled back to Marienwerder having accomplished exactly nothing except demonstrating that Prussian strategic thinking had evolved beyond the order's capacity to counter. Heinrich's squad lost 4 men during the pursuit, 3 to disease and 1 to a Prussian arrow that had punched through a gap in his helmet's aventail. The deaths were routine now, names added to a mental list too long to remember individually. Each casualty was replaced with a new recruit within weeks. the Order's supply of idealistic younger sons apparently inexhaustible. The machine required fresh bodies to function, and European nobility produced them faster than Prussia could kill them. Winter 1249 brought news that a major German prince was planning a grand crusade to Prussia, intending to bring thousands of knights and infantry in a coordinated campaign that would finally break Prussian resistance. The announcement generated brief optimism in the frontier garrisons, men hoping that overwhelming force might succeed where incremental pressure had failed. Heinrich knew better. Large armies required massive logistics, died faster from disease, and presented better targets for Prussian tactics. Size would amplify existing problems rather than solving them. The Prince's Crusade arrived in spring 1250 with pageantry that would have been impressive if it weren't so divorced from military reality. 5,000 men wearing fresh surcoats and polished armour paraded through Königsberg while locals cheered and priests blessed banners. The prince himself led from horseback, his armour gilded and engraved with religious imagery, a living embodiment of crusading propaganda. Heinrich watched from the garrison ranks, recognising a man who'd confused tournament combat with actual warfare, who believed divine favour would overcome tactical deficiencies. The Grand Crusade lasted 6 weeks. Disease killed thousands within the first month. The remaining forces launched attacks on Prussian positions that had been deliberately fortified to channel Christian aggression into killing zones. The battles were slaughters, armoured knights dying in marshes where horses couldn't manoeuvre, infantry cut down by arrows they couldn't see coming through forest cover. The Prussians had studied crusading warfare for half a century and knew exactly how to defeat it. Let the environment do most of the work, then finish survivors with precise applications of violence. The prince died during the Crusade's final battle, his gilded armour providing no protection against the spear that entered through his visor and exited through the back of his skull. His death broke the army's cohesion. The survivors retreated to coastal fortresses, abandoning equipment and wounded men in their panic. Of the 5,000 who'd arrived with such confidence, maybe 2,000 lived to see Germany again. The disaster validated everything Heinrich had learned. Size didn't matter, faith provided no protection, and Prussia killed everyone who entered regardless of noble birth or divine conviction. The order absorbed the survivors into frontier garrisons, distributing the prince's abandoned equipment to replace losses from years of attrition. Heinrich received a sword that had belonged to a dead nobleman, its blade engraved with Latin prayers that hadn't prevented its previous owner's death. He carried it without sentiment, recognizing it as a tool rather than a sacred object. The crusade had burned away his capacity for symbolism, leaving only pragmatic assessments of utility. A good sword was one that stayed sharp and didn't break. Everything else was decoration. By autumn 1250, Heinrich had served 7 years in Prussia. He was 24 years old but looked 40, his body aged by accumulated damage, and his face marked by scars and the premature lines of chronic pain. His hands shook from nerve damage, his hearing was degraded from being too close to exploding siege engines, and he coughed blood every morning from lungs that would never fully heal. The order had consumed his youth and would consume the rest of his life, using him until death or disability ended his service. The fortress routine continued through winter with the monotony of an existence reduced to survival. Prayer 7 times daily, training when weather permitted, equipment maintenance, guard duty, sleep in drafty barracks where men died from pneumonia they'd caught from each other. Heinrich moved through days without enthusiasm or despair, emotional range compressed to the narrow band between functional competence and complete breakdown. He'd become what the Crusade created, a man who'd stopped questioning, stopped feeling, stopped hoping for anything beyond continued existence. The new recruits who arrived in spring 1251 asked Heinrich why he'd stayed, why he hadn't requested transfer to a coastal posting or administrative position, away from active campaigning. The answer was simple. The order used veterans where they provided maximum value, and Heinrich's experience made him most useful on the frontier. His preferences were irrelevant. The vows he'd taken at 17 bound him until death, and the order would extract every ounce of utility from that commitment. He was property, a resource to be deployed without consultation or consent. Spring brought orders for another campaign, this one targeting a region the order had claimed to control but which Prussian forces had quietly reoccupied. Heinrich prepared his squad with the weary efficiency of a man performing familiar tasks without investment in outcomes. They'd march into hostile territory, kill whoever resisted, burn villages to deny resources to enemies, then retreat before disease or Prussian tactics destroyed them. The pattern was established, predictable, and would repeat until the crusade ended or everyone involved was dead. The campaign departed in May. 300 knights and supporting forces moving into forests Heinrich had burned through multiple times. The villages they'd destroyed in previous years showed new construction, Prussians reclaiming land the moment Christian forces withdrew. The Crusade's gains were temporary, territory controlled only while armies physically occupied it. The order called this expansion, but Heinrich recognized it as expensive stalemate, perpetual warfare that changed nothing except adding bodies to both sides' casualty lists. They burned the rebuilt villages again, killed or captured the inhabitants again, consecrated the ground again. The routine was so familiar it required no conscious thought. Violence reduced to procedure, executed with bureaucratic efficiency. Heinrich participated without emotion, his capacity for moral anguish exhausted years earlier. He'd crossed thresholds that couldn't be uncrossed, accumulated guilt that couldn't be absolved, become complicit in atrocities that couldn't be justified. The only path was forward, continuing because stopping required confronting what he'd done. The army established a fortified camp near a river, planning to hold position through summer while constructing yet another fortress. The labour began immediately, conscripted locals and prisoners cutting timber under guard while knights supervised. Heinrich watched the construction with the certainty that this fortress would be identical to all the others, stone and timber organised into walls and towers, a chapel proclaiming Christian authority, a dungeon for breaking resistance. The order was building an empire, one brutal fortification at a time, permanent occupation disguised as temporary military necessity. A supply convoy was ambushed during the construction, Prussian forces killing 30 men and capturing 2 wagons of food. The loss was significant but not catastrophic, merely another data point in the continuous attrition both sides endured. Friedrich, the commander who'd been demoted years earlier, had been right about everything. The crusade was unwinnable, sustained only by institutional refusal to acknowledge reality. But admitting that required destroying the entire justification for the order's existence, so the war continued despite consistent evidence it served no purpose beyond organisational self-perpetuation. Heinrich sat on half-built fortress walls watching the sun set over forests filled with enemies who wanted Christians dead. 7 years of killing, dying, and moral compromise had achieved precisely nothing, except expanding the order's territorial claims and filling graves. The Prussians were still resisting, still capable of inflicting casualties, still refusing the conversion the crusade was supposedly offering. The mission was failed but ongoing, perpetual warfare that benefited no one except the administrative apparatus managing it. A priest came to offer confession, the weekly ritual that allowed knights to clear accumulated sin before adding more. Heinrich declined, explaining he'd stopped confessing because the words had lost meaning. Admitting guilt required believing actions were wrong, and he'd exhausted his capacity for moral judgment. He killed because the order ordered it. He destroyed because vows demanded it. The responsibility was institutional rather than personal, a comfortable lie that made continuation possible. The priest insisted that faith could still provide comfort, that God's forgiveness extended to those serving his crusade. Heinrich responded that if this was God's crusade, then God was a monster, and if it wasn't, then they were all damned regardless of confessions. The priest left without argument, recognizing a soul so thoroughly broken that theology couldn't repair it. Heinrich didn't feel broken. He felt clear-eyed, finally seeing the crusade without the distorting lens of religious justification. The fortress reached completion in August, dedicated with familiar ceremony and immediate occupation. A garrison of 100 men would hold it through winter, enduring the same cold, hunger and isolation every frontier posting experienced. They'd launch raids when weather permitted, maintain the appearance of Christian control, and die slowly from accumulated damage, both physical and psychological. The crusade would continue because it always continued, an institution that had achieved escape velocity from rational assessment. Heinrich was reassigned to Marienburg in autumn 1251, promoted to training new recruits after years of frontier service. The transfer was supposed to be reward, acknowledgement of his experience and survival. It felt like failure. Removed from active campaigning not for excellence but because accumulated injuries had degraded his combat effectiveness below useful thresholds. The order was done breaking his body, moving him to positions where damaged goods could still provide value. Marienburg looked exactly as it had when Heinrich first arrived 8 years earlier. The walls were the same stone, the chapel the same architecture, the training yard where idealistic boys learned to kill still functioning with brutal efficiency. Nothing had changed except Heinrich. The boy who'd entered believing propaganda had been replaced by a veteran who understood exactly what the crusade was. Perpetual warfare serving organizational interests, dressed in religious rhetoric and sustained by institutional momentum. The Teutonic Order would continue crushing Prussian resistance until successful or destroyed, and either outcome was decades away. Heinrich took his position among the training staff, joining other scarred veterans who'd been rotated off the frontier. They taught sword forms, explained siege tactics, and carefully avoided discussing what crusading actually felt like. The recruits would learn through experience, the way everyone did. Words couldn't convey the reality of disease killing more than combat, of moral compromises accumulating until conscience went silent, of being trapped in an organization that consumed lives and called the process holy. The white cloak hung in Heinrich's quarters, its black cross worn but still visible. He'd put it on thousands of times, the ritual so familiar it required no thought. Each time he wore it, he represented the Teutonic Order's mission, converting pagans, expanding Christendom, serving God's will through organized violence. The symbolism was supposed to provide meaning, purpose that transcended individual suffering. Instead, it marked him as complicit in systematic brutality, a willing participant in genocide justified by theology most knights barely understood. Heinrich stood in the training yard watching new recruits execute sword drills, their movements clumsy but eager. They believed they were training for holy war, for crusades that would earn salvation through faithful service. No one would tell them that crusading meant killing families, burning homes, dying from contaminated water. They discover it themselves, the way Heinrich had, the way everyone did. The machine needed fresh bodies to function, and European nobility provided them with reliable consistency. The sun set over Marienburg's walls, marking the end of another day in an institution that had existed before Heinrich, and would continue after his death. The Teutonic Order was larger than any individual, an organisation that had perfected the art of turning religious conviction into colonial expansion. They'd crusade in Prussia until successful or bankrupt, sacrificing thousands of lives in pursuit of goals that served institutional interests rather than divine will. Heinrich understood this completely. Understanding changed nothing. The machine ground forward regardless, consuming everyone it touched. The black cross on white background fluttered in the evening wind, visible for miles. It marked Marienburg as Christian territory, the Order's headquarters, the heart of a crusading enterprise that had lasted decades and would likely continue decades more. Prussian resistance hadn't broken despite consistent pressure. Christian forces hadn't achieved decisive victory despite technological advantages. The war had settled into perpetual stalemate, endless conflict that destroyed everyone involved without resolving anything. This was Heinrich's life now. This was the Crusade's truth. Nothing glorious, nothing holy. Just organised violence continuing because stopping required admitting it had always been pointless.